It's always so exciting to talk to someone with as much talent and a consistent style like yourself. And before we get into talking about Nepal and studio portraits and all of that, the first thing I need to know is, how is it that you first got into photography?
Oh, wow. That's a great question, honestly. I think in my teens, I was sort of part of the hip hop culture. So doing skateboarding and graffiti and so forth and so on. And then within that particular culture, it was, documenting what we were doing came pretty close at hand. So I think my interest sort of sparked around that time. So maybe 13, 14. And since then it has sort of, shaped form over the years. But it's always been sort of lurking in the background. And just in the recent couple of years, I've really sort of went all in, so to speak, if that makes sense.
And obviously starting off with photographing, I'm assuming like your friends skateboarding and the stuff that you're doing, you get used to photographing people. Is there something in particular about photographing people compared to, say, landscape photography or architecture that really inspires you?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's the human encounter, the human meeting. It's such a beautiful thing, right? And not to downplay sort of the aesthetics or the wonders of landscaping or architecture photography, but just the human encounter and the meeting and the dynamics of having a conversation with another person. It's hard to compare. It's I think in a sense it's more organic, even though I know that word is kind of saturated, but it's growing in a sense. I really learned to love it, the dynamics of portrait photography.
Well, something that I absolutely loved about your work, there's images of yours from Nepal, one particular portrait of a gentleman in Albania, loads of different images, and even the stuff that you do in studio. There feels like there's a piece of the person in every image. It doesn't feel like it's an image of someone trying to always look their best, as amazing as they do look. It looks like an honest portrait, which is actually something that I feel like gets lost quite a lot with portrait photographers these days. They get so caught up in making someone look as good as possible. They don't always necessarily give you much of an honest portrait. What's your sort of process to make people comfortable with you and your camera?
Oh, great question. Again, I think it depends on the context. You were referring to Albania and Nepal, and there you have a big language barrier. So then, honestly, I lower my guard as much as possible. I open up with a smile, and even though I know they do not speak the language, I try to sort of articulate my idea. So I always sort of pitch my idea and ask for permission, if that makes sense. And just, body language, again, a big smile. And usually 9 out of 10 times you get a yes, and sometimes you get a no. But hey, that's just the way the cookie crumbles, I presume. And in the studio, it's a different ballgame altogether. Then usually I sit down like you and I do right now, Kris, and just try to have an honest conversation about sort of why we're doing this and who am I and where do I come from, sort of tell my story a bit. And then, try to be as honest and as genuine as possible. And my experience is if you sort of, if you're communicating in that way, then sort of they will lower their guard as well. And then, you have oftentimes a really a deep conversation about life, and you sort of, you build trust. And then from there, sometimes it's half an hour, sometimes, you sit down for 2 hours before even taking the first picture. And then I feel like, okay, we got a nice vibe, a good mood in the studio. So let's begin making pictures. So that's my process, I would say. I still have a lot to learn, and I'm still refining it. But just trying to stay as real as possible. That seems to be a good formula for portraits.
Well, somewhere like Nepal in particular, I feel like having an incredibly big, expensive, flashy camera is going to be something that's going to draw a lot of fear and maybe a lot of attention, a lot of apprehension from people.
Yes.
What do you do in terms of gear when you're somewhere like Nepal?
For Nepal, I brought a digital DLSR, and I've been shooting digital with Nikon for quite some time. So I brought that. It's very reliable, and I really like the imagery that comes from that particular camera. And then usually for travel photography, I bring a fixed 21 millimeter lens from Karl size, and a 50 millimeter, or in Nikon's case, they have a beautiful 58. So that's my sort of go-to lenses. I try to bring a tripod just because you never know what kind of situations you will face. But oftentimes I never use the tripod, but it's always in my rucksack, you know.
And are you showing them images as you go? Do you let them have a look at the back of the camera to kind of see what you're doing?
Oftentimes I ask for an email, and if one of the shots looks really solid, I'll show them, you know, right there and then. But oftentimes I don't show pictures like that. But I'm very happy to sort of print them and send them via the postal office or send an email. But I'm not sure. How do you go about things when you're working? Are you keen on showing your pictures on the go, or do you prefer showing the final image?
Do you know, it's funny, if I'm photographing, so I photograph generally like actors, models, people like that. I have no major issue with showing them the camera. The only issue that does come up is just it slows down the process when you start to get a good flow and it feels like you're kind of working towards something. You're working through some ideas in terms of like expression, and they want to see every other picture. That can drive you a bit mad. I tend to restrict that. When it comes to weddings, and I don't know about around the world, in England, the younger generation of people have a very particular idea about the way that they look because they've seen themselves every single day in selfies. So they have this idea that every picture of them should look like it was taken with an iPhone from like just above head height, with them standing in exactly the same position over and over again. And with weddings, I can find brides, it sometimes doesn't serve so well to show them the back of the camera because they have a very fixed idea of what they think they should look like. I think selfies are ruining a lot of people in England from sort of having good, honest pictures taken because they're so used to being in total control of the way that they look.
Oh yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, it makes perfect sense, I suppose, if you've grown up with, you know, the phone and the selfie expression. Yeah, and I can definitely see how that sort of will ruin your workflow. It sounds challenging.
You mentioned the language barrier, and obviously somewhere like Nepal, it's an enormous jump from English or Swedish to speaking to people native to Nepal. How do you go about that? Do you have an interpreter with you? Do you travel with someone that's going to sort of help get the message across?
Yes and no. For the this particular trip in Nepal, I had a guide, and I suppose maybe 30% of the pictures he was sort of present, and I think 70% he was not present. I think if you can afford a guide, it can really add some depth to your journey. I mean, so many anecdotes and stories will get lost in translation. And especially sort of if you're wandering, you know, in sort of the outskirts of the trails and tracks, you will encounter some really beautiful people that have amazing stories to tell. And so I was quite fortunate to have him on my side. But again, I think just body language and smile a lot, just try to be, you know, expressive through your body language. It seems to work quite well, honestly. And then other journeys, I prefer actually travel by myself. I kind of prefer that method, you know. Do you have a style of shooting when you're sort of in foreign land?
Yeah, I think like the most difficult I've had is photographing Arabic people who weren't, obviously they're not particularly keen on Western people because of recent years' experience.
Yeah.
I'm fortunate in the sense that I'm married to someone from Iraq, so I can kind of use that as a bit of an in. But most of the time, when I travel, I need to sort this out really, but I get far too fixated on the places that I am than I am the people. Even though I like photographing people normally, when I travel, I seem to get completely I seem to get some kind of like brain freeze, and I get so focused on the actual landscape or the architecture or something. And I think maybe because it's easier, and I like to have kind of a bit of time off from photographing people, because I photograph like, well, when there's not a pandemic, I photograph like 70 weddings a year. I photograph probably 100 times between that with different actors and models and stuff. And yeah, I tend to, when I travel, I think maybe the language barrier is just more effort that I'm willing to put in, because I'm already probably trying my luck by walking around with a camera when my wife just wants to have a nice holiday.
Yeah, I can relate to that too. But let me ask you a question. So let's see that you have a person with a really interesting facial expression, and the lighting is just beautiful. And if you don't sort of challenge yourself to make that photo, to make that portrait, how do you feel afterwards?
Oh, terrible. I feel like I've let myself down. It's a lost opportunity. It's not a good feeling at all. And I've definitely been there. I remember being in the Emirates, and we had just gone on like a sand safari, been around some camels, and there's an amazing group of Arabic men stood around smoking, chatting, amazing texture, amazing light. Everything was just, it looked like something out of like National Geographic or something. And I was like, I don't want to bother them. I'll let them get on. We've got a lot of other stuff to focus on. I won't bother interrupting what they're doing. And then as soon as we left, I was like, fuck. Like, I completely wasted that. I should have taken the opportunity and at least tried. So it's not something you feel good about.
I totally agree.
I mean, on that note, if you don't mind me asking, because obviously judging by your work alone, you can tell that you're someone that's fantastic at grabbing the trust of people that you want to capture their image. A lot of photography, especially in the formative years, in the early stages when people are learning, they focus on gear, they focus on technique, they focus on settings mostly. It's all very much camera structured. And when you're photographing anything really, there's a lot of intangible skills. If you're a landscape photographer, you have to be fit, you have to be able to get up early, to go out to the right places, to get there at the right time. You have to do your research on that. And if you're photographing people, there's a lot of intangibles to that. You have to be able to build that trust, like we've said. How much of your skill as a photographer do you think is to do with the camera, and how much of it is to do with like your personality?
Again, Kris, great question. I think I might have to ponder that for a while. But I mean, the technical know-how, it's not rocket science, is it? But as you say, no. There are a few intangible sort of skills that you need to have in the skill set in order to create beautiful images. But I think, yeah, man, in the studio, maybe 65-70%. I keep referring to numbers. Sorry about that, but that's sort okay. of in favor of really getting to know the person and making him or her relax, feel at ease, open up. I think, yeah. So it's a 70-30 ratio. But that said, of course, you need to be on the ball, and when it comes to lighting and shadows and tones and contrast and all that jazz, And just the black and white portraits that I've been posting on Instagram this year, it really started as a technical pursuit, because I was very keen on looking and sort of getting inspired by the works of Irving Penn. And I really wanted to sort of, explore the black and white portrait space. So for me, then it started as a technical pursuit, but very, very quick, I realized, hey, yeah, the images it's good fun, it's rewarding, but really, honestly, what sparks me, what intrigues me is all these sort of great conversations that I have with these people, and I get to expand sort of my social circles, and yeah, this is truly great. It's been very rewarding, I shall say.
One thing I have noticed with your work, as well as getting these fantastic portraits of people that are very much aware that they're being photographed, you're able to capture quite a lot of candid moments that are almost like you're a fly on the wall. You are capturing something where it almost feels like no one knew you were there. That's something that I really value as a skill for any photographer, that ability to not need to be center stage and to kind of blend in and capture stuff as it's actually happening. I think that's a sign of someone that's really comfortable with themselves as a photographer. In your own preference, do you prefer images where the subject is very much aware of you, or do you prefer those candid moments?
Ah, wow. I think, candid moments, if they're, that would be my preference. That would be my favorite, because there's a big element of honesty and authenticity in those shots. And then again, I mean, directing people can be interesting as well. It sort of depends on the context and the setting, and then again on the subject. I mean, as you well know, Kris, if you're shooting actors or actresses or dancers, I mean, they will behave like, that's all they've been doing for their entire life, standing in front of the camera, and it will make your work very easy. And then just like a few pointers here and there, but basically you're just pressing the shutter. But if you have somebody who's very sort of awkward in front of the camera, then it's a different ball game. And if you can find candid shots among such a person, I think it can be really, really, really nice and beautiful. I'm not sure if that's the answer that you're looking for, but yeah, it's...
Sorry, if you don't mind me asking, what do you do if you don't like a person and you're kind of charged with taking their image? You like the look of them, but perhaps they're not the most agreeable person. How do you kind of push through that?
Oh, wow. So many good questions, man. Wow. Of course, the sort of the chemistry that you have with another person, that's a big thing in photography, right? I think just stay professional in your role and try to find some, like, a topic or a passion point where you can have some common ground and try to build from that. How do you go about it?
It's the hardest part of my job, honestly. It's like, when you're photographing someone, especially weddings, if you're photographing someone on their wedding day, and it does happen very rarely that they are just incredibly unlikable or that you don't mesh personalities, it's very hard to show someone in the best light and in the best way, so to speak, when they're someone that you just don't really, they don't make you feel particularly positive. So it took a long time for me to figure it out. But my main way was to kind of, this is going to sound terrible, and I really hope that I don't sound too bad here, but it's to kind of, when it's like that, I treat people like props and I focus more on the technical side of things so that I get my head out of being frustrated with maybe the interaction side of things. So I can kind of go a little bit onto autopilot with the interaction side of things and focus on the technical side of things, and then we can work through things a bit better. It's more about how I'm focused rather than the actual interaction, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Thanks for sharing that. I'll have that in mind as I move forward. But let me ask you another question then. Have you ever said no to an assignment based to the fact that, well, I'm not really sort of jiving with this person, chemistry seems off?
Yeah, a lot, to be honest. I mean, the most common reason for me to kind of back out of something or to not want to take part in something is that I don't think that what they're after is something that I'm suited to, and I don't want to do, like, I think there's enough work out there for photographers that you don't have to grab every piece of work available and do stuff that's not going to make you happy or that doesn't suit your style. It's going to end up making you look bad or anything like that. So I'll turn stuff down if I just don't think it quite connects with what I want to be doing. But yeah, there's been occasions where, like, it's just very obvious that it's not going to be a fun experience and that it's going to be very hard to push through the negativity. And in that case, I'll just sort of, I'll make a good excuse for why I'm not available.
Yeah. And I think it feels pretty good every now and then just to, to say no to an assignment. If you have good reasoning behind it, I think it sort of builds your confidence in a sense, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it makes you feel like you're in demand because you can walk away from something.
Yeah, and also that you have integrity of sorts, right?
Yes, 100%. Right, I'm very worried about taking too much of your time, and one of the ways that I actually found you was with your black and white images. You mentioned about being inspired by pen. One of the things that actually jumped out to me about the black and white studio images that you had taken was the consistency, and something that I'm very excited about whenever I find a new photographer is the consistency of their work, how much they can sort of reproduce something, develop a style, and you can see the evolution of that style, as opposed to every other image is completely wildly different from the last. So it's hard to pin down exactly what it is that they do. In your opinion, how important is it to you to be an incredibly consistent photographer and show your style that way?
I think it's very important, and for me, this was an exercise. I really wanted to commit and articulate my voice as a photographer, and in that sort of context, I really felt that I need to do something proper and do something stringent over time. And I said to myself, when the whole sort of pandemic thing happened, I said, all right, this is a great opportunity for me to stay positive and stay productive, because we have a shared studio. It's actually an old spaghetti factory in Stockholm, and all my photography mates, they were, you didn't see that one coming, did you?
Fair enough.
Yeah. But basically I had a place to myself, and I said, oh, this is a great opportunity to really sort of create. And that's what I set my intention to do. And that's what I've been doing. I haven't been posting all of my, far from, all of my portraits, but I'm gearing up towards sort of, an exhibition in early of next year. But going back to your question, I think, and especially sort of in the Instagram aesthetic side of things, it's consistency is key, right? But I can also feel to some extent that it can be a constraint, because I'm not sure how you go about things, but because then again, you want to show that you're able to manage all type of assignments, maybe not all types, but that you have a wide skill set, if you know what I mean. And if you're only working within a very sort of a niche, a small genre, then perhaps a few clients will miss your other skill sets.
Well, a common problem I think with photographers that have sort of all the gear at their disposal and maybe are a bit sort of scatterbrained is that they sort of jump wildly from one idea to the next, and the lack of constraints, as you put it, the lack of that actually sort of limits their chances of doing anything decent. I think that decent being, in the English sense of like good, not decent as in like Sorry, I'm using terribly dated slang, but it limits their ability to do something sort of consistently great, I guess, or to improve time on time. One thing with adding those constraints, as much as I actually find them to be sometimes crippling because I have a little bit of OCD when it comes to the way that I work, is that if you take a photographer that's struggling to pick their style or they're struggling to find their voice, if you just start to limit things like their gear and their, in studio, maybe limit their lighting setups and so on, that will start to help them flesh out what it is that they're actually trying to do as a photographer. Because sometimes when things aren't working, people just revert back to the same, well, if we just change, if I change lenses, all of a sudden it's going to be a better photo, and it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah, that's a great articulation of what I was trying to say. Thank you, Kris. That was great. and that's sort of an advice I tend to give to, if I have friends or acquaintances that are getting into photography. I say, hey man, just get yourself a 35 millimeter lens or a 50 and just use that for a year and see where it takes you. And then you can add sort of maybe, strobe lighting, or then you can go for a wider angle, or then you can dive into something else. But just really get to know a focal length or a certain kind of light and just be in that space. I think it's very rewarding, as you say. Then you really can sort of flush out the things that are not working and really focus and honing in on sort of what makes you spark as a photographer.
And then in terms of the work that you enjoy, are you someone that sort of values that consistency? Is that if you find a photographer that, okay, they might have, not every image might not be the best image you've ever seen, but if they have a style that you really enjoy and they consistently show that style, are you more likely to sort of track the progress of that photographer compared to someone that might have an amazing image followed by 10 random, not so amazing images that just, they don't match the style of what you first enjoyed?
Yes, I really gravitate towards consistency. Definitely, it's a good question, and if I reflect a bit on sort of the photographers which work I really admire and love, I think, yeah, I mean the motives and the scenery and sometimes the light, etc., can change, of course, and the assignments can change, but you can always see that sort of that the red thread that binds everything together style wise. So yeah, it's consistency. I think for me is very captivating. How do you think? How do you feel about consistency? It's a great question.
It's something that drives me absolutely mad when I see. So if I'm scrolling through Instagram or if I'm on something like 500px and I find an image that I just think looks absolutely amazing, I click on it, I go to look through the guy's work, and then every other image doesn't match the first one I found. I find it like it malfunctions my brain. It irritates me because I feel like I found someone that's going to be like a future source of inspiration. And then it turns out that they're a band that just had like one hit and all their other songs were terrible. And it's just very frustrating.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
I went to Finland about 7 years ago. I actually went to the Arctic Circle in Finland and photographed a wedding in February.
Oh, wow.
And one thing I do remember very distinctly as an incredibly inexperienced photographer at the time was that, you know, Scandinavia in February isn't sort of flush with light. It's a fairly restrictive place to shoot in terms of the light that you have available. Add in, of course, the weather compared to what we have in England, which is just constantly drizzling. It's not cold. It's not warm. It's not anything. If you don't mind me asking such a stupid and potentially offensive question, is being a Scandinavian photographer quite difficult given the light that you actually have available?
Yes and no. Going back to the constraints, I think each season has its qualities. And I mean, I can just fell in love with the sort of the racking lights, the morning lights, the late afternoon lights in the month of January and February, even though it's getting very close to the UK in terms of the gray pulp, you know. And I think since you know that you will only have a certain amount of quality light during those months, let's say the first quarter of the year, then perhaps you're more keen on planning ahead, you know. So if this scenario happens, what will I do? So and then it becomes more valuable in a sense, if that makes sense. And then again, I mean, if you're pushing towards May, June, July, then you know you have beautiful light. I did a shoot just the weekend after midsummer, an editorial shoot, and we were shooting at 11:30 in the night, you know, and it was just magical. So it's a double-edged sword, but going back to the question of constraints, I think the constraints can be a beautiful thing.
And then in terms of like the actual community over there with photography, what's the Swedish attitude towards photographers? In England, we are not always particularly welcome with members of the public because I guess there's a stereotype. I don't know about elsewhere in the world, but in England, there's a bit of a stereotype, which is that photographers sometimes can be, I've got to try and say this in a way that doesn't completely isolate the podcast and make me sound like a horrible person. But essentially the stereotype in England is that quite a lot of photographers are kind of dirty old men that like taking pictures of women.
I see. I think that can be a misconception at times, maybe. Mm-hmm. But honestly, just the feedback that I've been getting from people is basically it's like, oh, so you're doing photography? Oh, wow, that's amazing. So you can work with your passion, really? Oh, wow, right. That's a beautiful thing. That's more the sort of the feedback that I get on a high level. But of course, it depends on your style of photography as well. I mean, if you only have sort of bikini pictures of you know, teenagers, yeah, that might set the alarm off. It might, you know.
Let's talk about the subjects that you've had in studio for the black and white images. What makes a great in studio subject for you? What's your ideal subject in studio? What do they have to be as a person?
A character. For sure. And then how do you define a character? Well, it can be hard, but ideally somebody who has a story to tell, an interesting story that sparks my interest, you know? And then I think, oh, that's be a nice challenge. I wonder if we can create a magical portrait. I think we can. And that usually gets me going, So a character in terms of have been living an interesting life, or sometimes it can be a character, just a strong face, a strong expression. So one of the two would be the basis for a good studio subject. How do you think about that?
I tend to prefer, when it comes to the shoot as opposed to the end shot, I prefer photographing men. I find them much easier to break down the initial wall of what I was saying earlier about having that particular idea about the way that they want to look. Men tend to be a lot more open to interpretation when they're being photographed. And then really, my most important thing is that we're not, my biggest turn off as a photographer, like the thing that completely destroys a shoot for me, is when we start having conversations about social media, when they start talking about how many followers they have or algorithms or anything like that. The second that starts, I'm so shut down as a photographer. So as long as we avoid that, I mean, we could talk about almost anything. I mean, at the moment, obviously politics is something that gets quite frustrating because it comes up just about, every subject. People want to talk about politics at the moment. And sometimes that's not always the best because it steers people's mood sometimes towards the negative.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's just something where I find men are easier. This is going to sound terrible, but I find men are easier to manipulate their mood. You can set them up a lot easier. And they're a lot less guarded than female subjects are.
Oh, that's interesting. Just a reflection, going back to politics. I'm not sure why that is, but I think I'm 70 portraits deep in this black and white story. And I don't think never once did I talk about politics, which is, when I think about it, it's kind of crazy.
I might have jinxed you now. It might happen on the next one. And if it does, it's all my fault.
Nice.
If you don't mind me asking, because obviously we've talked about that consistency in style and so on, how do you go about sort of getting feedback on your images? Do you speak to photographers that you know and trust? Do you speak to non-photographers? Do you just absorb what naturally comes back to you from somewhere like Instagram or wherever? How do you go about sort of judging the feedback that you get on your images?
Another great question. I think that is definitely a area where I can improve and I can be more active. But honestly, my wife is sort of the one who validates my photography the most. So I always refer to her, and then I have a few good photography friends where I wouldn't say that it's so structured. It's more on the fly. Hey, what do you think about this and that? But I'm really looking to sort of foster a circle of photographers. Maybe it's a bi-weekly or a bi-monthly gathering, but you bring sort of your best 5 photos and you have a constructive conversation about your work and with the intent to grow as a photographer. So I'm really looking forward to set that up. And in November, I'm doing a 3-day workshop, just based on the black and white project with a curator and a few other people. And then hopefully I can really absorb some detailed feedback on my work. But I think absorbing feedback, it's huge. It's really a great recipe to grow. And then for the Instagram side of things, I mean, that's treacherous, right? It's interesting how it sometimes can sort of manipulate you to showcase work that you're not really feeling, but it might sort of resonate with your followers or with the algorithm or whatever. But I think if your intention as a photographer is to sort of win on Instagram and have a big account, that might be the way forward. But if you're committed to creating photography that is interesting to you and that hopefully will spark an emotion from the viewer, then I think that way of thinking is counterproductive.
Yeah, 100%. I had a conversation on the subject a few podcasts ago, and something that I brought up then, and I tend to be very stream of consciousness when I speak. I like most men, I don't think I think before I open my mouth. and sometimes that works wonderfully, and I actually surprise myself. And something that I said a couple of podcasts ago is about Instagram almost being like a strange anchor for creativity, because people that are creative have never had this metric before to find out how liked they are in the same way as what they have with Instagram, the number of followers, number of likes and so on. And what that's meant is that people have been more focused on chasing what is going to be metrically, sort of can be counted how popular it is, as opposed to doing what their expression is. So a lot of people have veered completely away from doing something that, speaks to them, that is expressive to them, and have actually sort of just gone down the road of chasing whatever trend is going to get them the most attention on social media. And I think it's going to be very interesting when we pull the rug out. And that's so, because they all do, they go through a cycle. And when Instagram eventually does finish its cycle and we move on to the next thing, how much people chasing those numbers are going to, how they're going to kind of deal with that being pulled out from them. Because if you're leaning really hard on just being popular and then we pull the popularity away, you're going to be a bit empty, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think it's very interesting, the social media side of things. And again, depending on how you use it, but Instagram obviously goes without saying, but you need to be there as a photographer. It's a great channel for marketing, etc., and showcasing your work, your portfolio. And also this hyper validation, since there's so much talent on Instagram. So quite quickly, at least I can find myself looking at my work and then validate towards somebody else's and say, oh, my work is horseshit, So I think you have to be mindful of sort of, that aspect of it too.
Because you're on the subject, if we talk self-evaluation a little bit here.
Yeah.
Where you are now as a photographer, do you feel like you're on course in the direction that you want to be going on and the destination you eventually want to kind of end up at as a photographer? Do you feel like you're, like, generally, obviously we all have bad days, we all have good days, but on the whole, do you feel like you're on course to in the right direction for where you want to be going as a photographer?
Yes, I'm saying that with a humble tongue, but yeah, 100%. I definitely feel that I am on course, and I'm very grateful for that. It's been my second year as a full-time photographer, and of course, as you say, you have good days and you have bad days, but I think I'm deviating from the question, but just being able to do work that you are passionate and do work that you're really sort of interested about in photography. I think if you're able to do that, man, then you are on course, Good things will happen for sure, because you have that enthusiasm, you have that spark of passion, and I'm sure you have the drive. Yes, good things will happen. You are on course, just stay there. Every once in a while, you will be hit by a curveball, but just up in the saddle again, back to the drawing board, back to sort of your goals for the year, revise them. Where are we going? Sort of, it's, I feel that way. How do you feel, man?
Oh, I tend to deviate between thinking I'm the worst photographer on earth and then thinking on a good day that I've got a hell of a lot of improving to do. So I tend to sit on the very bottom end of the scale of being happy with where I'm going with things. But the one thing I've always said, and I've been really consistent about this, and I always get, there's usually about 90% of the time people give me a really funny look about this, or they think I'm being completely dishonest. I sort of, ideally, I'd like to be the worst photographer in the world, because
that's interesting.
Well, I absolutely genuinely love photography. I spend hours a day looking at photography. Obviously, I do the podcast. I speak with photographers. I spend all of my energy sort of searching out people at the moment to come on the podcast and to sort of put their work out and inspire people. I love photography so much. And if I'm the worst one in the world, that means that everybody else will be inspiring me. And I genuinely just feel a lot of passion for photography in general. And I just my problem is I don't know how much I'm contributing to sort of the zeitgeist of photography in general. But yeah, I'm not someone that's overly happy with my work. I tend to be someone that every sort of 9 to 12 months deletes every image on their Instagram and starts again, and methodically, manically tries to put together something looking a bit like a portfolio and fails miserably. And then I repeat the cycle.
Yeah, no. I just wanted to revert back to your question. I totally relate to towards your expression as well, Kris. And I have huge doubts about my skill set as a photographer. Huge, honestly. So it's not that I'm struggling to find the English word. It's not that I'm blowing air up my ass, but just in terms of feeling that you have somewhat of a good rhythm, feeling that you have a good vibration in your line of work. Yes, that I feel right now. But that does not take away from the fact that oftentimes I look at my imagery and think that they're shit, I just wanted to be clear on that note.
Well, it's you definitely weren't coming across like that. I think it's
thanks.
No, but it's one of those things where if someone's looking at work of the standard of yours and they can hear that you are not always 100% happy, I think for a lot of people that are developing their style or maybe aren't as positive about their own work, it can actually be quite reassuring because it shows that being insecure or having self-doubt is actually part of being a creative. It's not something that you should feel bad about. That's just part of being someone that's putting their expression out there, is that you're not always going to be happy with it. And I think people misinterpret showing a bit of vulnerability as making themselves look bad, when in actual fact, it's not. We pretty much all feel some flavor of the same way about it. It's just a lot of people hide it and pretend that they think that every image they take is amazing.
Yeah, no. The self-doubt is definitely a part of putting yourself out there and then putting out work. At least for me, it can be crippling at times, but I think it's also a part of the human condition, Yeah. But I think, and I'm eager to hear how you go about that. But for me, just trying to change the framing of that into curiosity. For me, it seems to work quite well. So really trying to foster a mind of curiosity and cultivating that feeling inwards, So so this should didn't go as I planned, but what can I learn from this experience? Because there's always things to learn, right? And I mean, in jiu-jitsu, you talk about white belt mentality. In Buddhism, you talk about beginner's mind. This type of reasoning and thinking has many names, but I think it can really be beneficial in the creative field. There's always so much to learn. Always.
As much as he's an unlikable dickhead, Conor McGregor says you either win or you learn, and I think that's a pretty good mentality to have.
Yeah, for sure. No, he's on point.
He could beat the shit out of me, but he is a bit of a dickhead. So very quickly, because I really don't want to take up too much of your time, and I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. When it comes to inspiration, a lot of people sort of deviate quite wildly on this. It seems to be a bit of a polarizing subject. Are you someone that sort of surrounds yourself with inspiration in terms of like mood boards or photo books and whatnot? Or are you someone that when you're about to shoot, you kind of completely shut all that stuff out so that you kind of avoid sort of subconsciously copying other people's ideas?
Another great question, Kris. Thanks for asking that. I'm beginning to sound like a broken record here, but it's really good questions. So in terms of mood boards, yes, I love mood boarding. I'll do that not every day, but very often. If I see a strong visual, if I see a strong photo, I'll bookmark it, or I'll save it in my folder, or I'll print it out, or I'll buy the book. Definitely. And in terms of my own method as a photographer, I always want to have some sort of reference for what I'm aiming for at the shoot. It can be like a certain posture. It can be a facial expression. It can be an overall emotion. But I always have that in my back pocket, and I'm not afraid of bringing it out if I feel that I hit a wall during the session. So as a insurance, I'm not necessarily dictating the shoot upon that image, but it's something that I want to have close by if I feel that, okay, we're stuck here. And as I try to stay inspired as much as possible, definitely. So I try to have inspiring friends, and I try to do inspiring stuff, I suppose. And also, you mentioned the topic of photo books. Yes, I'm a hoarder when it comes to photography books. It's I just look at my library here. It's my wife is not so happy about all the books, but but I am. Let me put it that way.
Well, there's worse ways to spend money than books.
Yeah, and I think it's a great investment, to be honest, especially photography books. That said, I also, I'm gonna sound rather cliche. Sorry about that, but just the tactile emotion of having a book in your hand, and I think photography as a medium really shines through on sort of on the print, on the paper. So I'm looking at photo books every day.
You've mentioned pen, and I think that for anyone that really has spent even half a minute looking at his work, can completely. You can fall in love, and you can kind of get a little bit lost, and also it can kind of it can sort of destroy a little bit of your self-confidence. It can be very humbling to see the work of someone like him.
For sure.
Are there any other names that jump out as like big inspirations of yours?
Yeah, perhaps not within that genre, but if I take a step back, I really like Jonas Bendiksen from the Magnum Collective. He's very inspirational on many levels. Going back to the black and white vein, Sebastião Salgado is a true master. Perhaps the GOAT. In terms of commercial portraits, I really like Joey L. His way of working with lighting is just beautiful, really inspirational. And yeah, I mean, there's so many good photographers. I'm just looking in my. Yeah, there's a beautiful book. If you're into portraits, and this guy is a New Zealand photographer. His name is Jono Rotman. I can send you his details afterwards. And he has a beautiful book called Mongralism. It's about this Kiwi motorcycle gang, and he's been making some beautiful large format portraits. It's really captivating. I mean, it's so powerful. So yeah, lots of inspirational photographers. How about yourself, Kris? Do you have any that comes to mind?
Yeah, I've got. Yeah, I could probably bore people all day. I mean, ones that immediately jump out, ones that just always stop me. Agata Serge in Poland, Peter Lindbergh. Obviously, I think Peter Lindbergh should be on everyone's sort of go-to list of how to photograph big personalities.
Yeah,
Peter Coulson's a big one for me. Emily Soto. I could probably just also direct people to the list of podcasts that I've done for people that inspire me, because that tends to be the way that I go. Everyone whose work I love, I tend to badger about coming on the podcast and hope that they will, and then I can ask them some annoying questions. And the whole point of the podcast is essentially just to push people in that direction anyway. And basically, it's a big list of me saying, these are people that inspire me. Go and follow them. Go and look at their work. Go down that rabbit hole. I have a question for you, and it's something I've asked almost every portrait photographer, and to date, I don't think maybe one person has actually been able to answer it without sidestepping it. So I'm going to ask you this question, and I'm putting a lot of faith in you here to break the cycle of people not answering. So right now, in your black and white project, let's say, or an environmental portrait, however you want to do it, if there was one person you could photograph, who would the one person be?
Dead or alive?
Up to you.
Miles Davis.
Oh, wow. That was really straightforward.
Yeah.
How come?
I'm a big fan. And ever since I read his biography, I was just blown away about his story, his way of living, his beautiful artistic expression, just seemed to be such a rich person in many ways. And obviously with a very dysfunctional lifestyle too, but just an interesting human being altogether, right? So fascinating.
So is it the case then that you're, and excuse the way that I'm going to phrase this, obviously this is coming off the top of my head, but you kind of are using photography as a human study for yourself?
100%. Yes. It didn't start that way necessarily, but yeah, it's something that it warped into, I suppose. And it's a beautiful thing.
It's also a wonderful motivation as well.
Yes, it is. But again, I'm going to sound rather cliche, but it is very interesting how the camera, how photography really can work as an alibi, to hijack somebody that you would like to have a conversation with. I know you do that because you have this beautiful podcast that you're working on, and it's really a door opener, a key to rooms and doors that's otherwise might have been locked or not reachable,
Yeah.
So it's definitely one of the big perks with photography, the way I see it, at least.
So we'll do a couple of quick fire questions and then I'll let you get on with your day. First question is, what do you think your biggest strength is as a photographer?
My biggest strength as a photographer, I would refer back to the people person aspect, that I'm quite good at getting people to relax and being themselves in front of the camera. So that would be my biggest quality.
And then on the flip side, what do you think your biggest weakness is?
My biggest weakness is, I think, I have so many weaknesses as a photographer. I'm not sure which one to pick, but honestly, editing, I think, is a big weakness of mine.
What, in terms of ability or just your style, or?
I think ability and also the amount of time that I put into it. Yeah, I think it can be a big time thief of sorts.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I think as well, if you've ever, I don't know, it's a big barrier because you take an image that you want to share with the world, and then the editing sort of prolongs the pain of wanting to put the stuff out. You know what I mean? So it's almost like it can be good in that way, that it kind of holds you back from posting stuff or publishing stuff too early before you've had a good chance to kind of absorb what you've done. One thing I struggle with massively when it comes to editing is actually the image selection, in the sense that I have that problem of like emotional attachment to certain images, or I remember certain parts of a shoot more fondly than others. And then I gravitate towards those images, and they might not be the strongest ones. And that, having that period of time helps.
Yeah, for sure. And do you also reiterate your work with a coworker, or?
Yeah. So I do what you do. I go to my boss, which is my wife, and make sure that she's content with what my selections are. She tells me whether I'm right or wrong, and then I'm allowed to move on from there.
Well said, mate. Well said.
All right. So the absolute most important part of the podcast, if nothing else is taken from it, it's this bit, which is the fact that the podcast is to help people find amazing photographers. That's why you're on here. I want people to find your work. So where are the best places on the internet for people to find you?
Definitely. Just go to Instagram and martin.kiessling at Instagram. That's my IG handle. And that's where I'm most, that's where I put my work basically. And I'm working on reamping my homepage, my portfolio, but I'm not quite there yet. So yeah, please follow me on Instagram and we'll take it from there.
Martin, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Likewise, buddy. I love what you do. Keep it up. Very inspiring.